Hello then, good afternoon. This is L24 daily special coverage, and today we take a look at the main developments as the Russia-Ukraine war enters its 190 days. In the southeastern Ukraine, inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, were set to visit the Zaporizhian nuclear power plant after months of growing international alarm over the fighting surrounding the facility, which has been occupied by the Russian forces since March. Still in the south, all eyes now are on Ukraine's counteroffensive as the country's military leaders says that they have made progress. President Vladimir Zelensky said he is confident and confident Ukraine's forces will push the occupying Russian forces back to the pre-2014 borders. On the other side, Russia's state-owned energy firm Gazprom has halted gas supplies via the Nord Stream 1, or rather the one pipeline to Western Europe on Wednesday for 3 days. Due to maintenance on Nord Stream 1, there would be no gas flow to Germany between August 31st, or rather the 31st of August, to the September 3rd. To analyze all this information, I'm joined live by Mr. Denis Speed, a founding member of Schiller Institute from New Jersey, USA. And from Ukraine, Dr. Alexei Semeny, director of the Institute for Global Transformation in Kiev. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us in this debate. A short break and we will be back. And before we delve into our discussion, let me read for you this piece of information. Gentlemen, an inspection team from the International Atomic Energy Agency is on its way to the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, southern Ukraine, which has been the target of bombardments for several weeks. The largest nuclear power plant in Europe is in the hand of the Russian army since the beginning of March.
Дуже дякую сьогодні.
I am very grateful today for the arrival of the International Atomic Energy Agency mission in Ukraine. This is probably one of the highest priority issues concerning the security of Ukraine and the world today, due to the occupation of our nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia by Russian soldiers and the establishment of a high risk of a potential explosion. We want the IAEA mission, led by Director Grossi, to find a way, through our special services and security corridors, to reach the plant and do the maximum to avoid all dangers on a global scale.
We are now finally moving after 6 months of strenuous efforts. The IAEA is moving in to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. As you know, we have a very, very important task there to perform, to assess the real situation there, to help stabilize the situation in as much as we can. And I am really very conscious of the relevance of this moment, but we are ready. The IAEA is ready. So we will be reporting back after the mission. We are going to be spending a few days there.
Dr. Semeny, since you are in Ukraine, I'll be starting with you. On one hand, Ukraine is saying that Russia is still shelling around Sloviansk in the south. And on the other hand, Russians are stating that Ukrainian troops are still bombing near the nuclear facility. So how can you simply justify these shellings that all the world is warning about? It could cause a disaster.
First of all, there is a difference between Ukrainians and Russians in actually explaining what is happening. From our point of view, the challenge with regard to Zaporizhia nuclear power stations has been made actually by the Russian forces. Because from the Ukrainian side, there is actually no logic to bomb this facility due to many reasons. And actually, if you take the history how it was taken by the Russian forces, Due to this station, very sophisticated and built as a very stronghold capacity, Ukrainian forces in March could have had actually much more efforts to push back Russian forces, but they did not, because they did not want to risk the whole facility being bombed, attacked by the Russian forces. So we left the station in March. Therefore now, it's not in our interest having quite a lot of reasons for this station to be safe, because it's still the part of our electricity grid, it's part of our electricity system. So for ourselves, there is no logical reasons. I don't exclude that maybe somebody from Ukrainian side has been shelled in some vicinity of this capability, because Russian military forces has been stationed inside this facility, which is absolutely idiotism from many points of view, because there should be some norms in this society, in this world, and to put at risk nuclear facility by our own military forces stationed in there, it's huge level of irresponsibility. So from our point, it's not we shelling the station, but let's be honest, the unbiased view could be presented by, let's call it, some third authority, be it from satellite imageries, be it from some absolutely unbiased third neutral party, just to tell fully who has been shelling this station. But from my point of view is, Ukraine has no logical reason to shell this station, because we need this station be in operation, B, to be quite in a good sense of operational capability after we deoccupy these territories.
Very good indeed, and it's very question you have raised, why Ukrainians shelled this facility. Mr. Speed, how can you explain the continuous shelling of a Zaporizhian nuclear power plant? Why neither Russia nor Ukraine is thinking of the world safety? Europe already witnessed the catastrophic disaster of Chernobyl in 1986. Why? They keep escalating the situation over there. I mean, who can hold them responsible for their actions?
Well, let's just look at something as has already been said. There's shelling going on. Each side is saying the other is doing the shelling. Everyone is talking about a disaster, but it's happening anyway. Now, there are a few ways to look at this. One is that there's a war going on, and in wars, despite the fact that people like to believe that logic prevails, often it doesn't. Secondly, often people like to believe that two sides fight a war, but maybe there are more than two sides fighting the war, i.e., let's take a very clear look at NATO and NATO's interest in this situation. The situation is that the prolonging of this conflict at this time is a disaster, period. So who's really benefiting for it? To say Ukraine is benefiting for it, well, Ukraine is saying it's not negotiating with Russia. This is clear. But it's also true that there are no negotiations at all. The IAEA is on the scene. What this tells us is that we should be able to get, in any case, a report as to who is shelling, because shelling will either stop or it will continue. And so, in one sense, this is one of these situations that's going to begin to reveal itself rather quickly. So I don't really think that you have to get involved in whose interest it is, because one could say it's in no one's interest. Why would it be in the interest of the Russian troops that are occupying the plant? Why would it be in the interest of the Russians to bomb their troops? So when people start talking about this issue of interests, it's kind of late to talk about that. We're talking about a conflict which itself cannot end except one way: the devastation of Ukraine.
Quite understood. Staying with this idea, Mr. Speed, Russia has been called by more than 42 countries to withdraw its troops from the nuclear plant. So how can you explain these calls when one of the main reasons why Russia launched this military operation in the first place was to put a hand on these nuclear plants? I mean, why can't they call on the Ukrainian authorities to stop the shelling over there and try a peaceful talk over a nuclear facility, which is a logical and the rational solution to this dilemma?
The last thing that this conflict has been characterized by in the recent period is rationality. I think what's important here, you say 42 countries have called upon the Russians to do something. Yeah, but the problem involved is, from the beginning of this conflict, what was being done was that you were pursuing the conflict at a point where it was clear. Is it that no one knew that the nuclear power plant was there? Is it that no one knew that this facility would be occupied? Is it that no one knows that the war being continued at this point has reached the point of absurdity? Is it that no one knows that negotiations have to occur? I mean, you can't say that that's the case. And so, again, I point out, actors here are difficult to determine because NATO is involved, specifically on the Ukrainian side, in something called the Resistance Occupation Command. There are about 37,000 operatives, not merely mercenaries, that have been trained by NATO in a joint special operations command being run out of Germany largely, and that's operating behind the lines of Russia in this conflict. So I don't know that I'm going to say that Ukraine alone is doing this. Matter of fact, I don't think that the Ukrainian military is doing much alone at all at this point.
Quite interesting. Coming to you, Mr. Dr. Semeni, what is your expectation from this visit? Do you think this delegation would manage to find a peaceful solution? And how can, or rather how could, Zelensky made promises to bring back Crimea last week while he is still fighting over the eastern part of the country?
Let's split the question into two. The first one, I expect there is actually a probability that this mission at least will stabilize situation. I don't expect that the result of the mission will be immediate retreat of Russian forces from the facility, although there is needed that all the forces of Russian Federation should retreat from this facility at least, not from the city Energodar, but from this facility. But the result could be the general agreement on the, let's call it, status quo, and second, maybe on some permanent presence of representatives from International Atomic Energy Agency there on the facility to safeguard the facility from any kind of the challenge, to safeguard the operational modus of the station, because last week there was a very disastrous case when the station has been cut off of any voltage line from outside for some period of time, and this was a direct threat for operation in 2 nuclear power blocks. So this should be prevented in any case, because it's still the station is operating inside Ukrainian electricity grid, and actually from technical point of view managed by Ukrainian specialists who has been taken by Russian forces as actually some kind of shield. But the second question, how could President Zelensky talk about liberation of Crimea without having pushed out Russians from other parts of Ukraine? This is a long distance maybe, or not so long distance, but in any case, any Ukrainian politician, started from the president or anybody else, will tell you that sooner or later, be it Donbass, be it Crimea, they will be liberated by Ukraine, because it's our territory, internationally recognized by everybody. So you can count on many things, but in any time you will see. You will see, because it's some kind of historical reality that Russia, okay, can press somebody, can coerce some neighbors, but sooner or later, actually the, let's call it, justice and logic, historical logic will prevail about any kind of attempts of aggressor.
Very good, Dr. Semeni. So time will reveal. Now moving on to tackle second point. The Russian gas giant Gazprom has suspended this Wednesday until September the 3rd the supply of gas to Germany through the Nord Stream gas pipeline for maintenance work on the only pumping equipment in operation of infrastructure.
Russia uses economic terror, pressures with price crises and poverty to weaken Europe just when it needs its full strength to defend against the terror at war that Russia has been conducting for over 6 months.
Putin is playing a game with Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. I think it's kind of a game. Our problem right now is that we are not in a position to adequately respond to this game. That's the task ahead of us, to try and inject as much as possible.
Mr. Speed, in your analysis, now Germany is going to face this energy. How they will face this energy shortage? I mean, why would they push Russia to its limit to cut the gas supplies? They couldn't even manage to find alternatives such as Italy, but they kept the strong standing against Russia. Why? The Germans now are going to pay their government's debts.
Well, what has happened is that the financial nuclear war that was announced that was going to be fought against Russia by the French finance minister in particular, and also in a different way by the Germans and others, has been lost. The financial nuclear war has been won by Russia. That's what's actually occurred. In other words, what happened was that the transatlantic sector had no actual capabilities to back up what they thought was going to be a circumstance in which they were going to be able to somehow destroy the Russian economy, compromise the Russian military, and compromise the ruble. Instead, what has happened is that Russia is at a situation in which it's having virtually record profits, including in its oil industry. So when you look at what has actually happened, basically the war-winning strategy, so-called, the triumphalist war-winning strategy of NATO has backfired. And that's essentially it. I mean, the Russians wanted to operate Nord Stream 2. That was stopped by the Germans initially. Then Nord Stream 1, well, there may or may not be maintenance questions, but the real issue here is really much different. It's that NATO, the United States, Great Britain in specific, announced a set of measures that have now completely failed. They backfired, but fundamentally, they may have actually strengthened the Russian military and strengthened the Russian economy, and that's inevitable. This is called the March of Folly. It's been seen before in American history, it's been seen before in European history. What happened in Vietnam, what happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan is now happening here, and it will happen, by the way, in Taiwan. That same policy will happen.
Quite understood. We will come over the Taiwan situation. Dr. Semini, we all know that Russia is using the energy sector as leverage against all European countries. But what about Ukraine? How Ukraine is living the next months? Winter is coming.
If we're talking about gas supply, we are feeling more or less sure because I should remind you, Ukraine has its own gas industry, gas extraction. Now our actual gas reserves are more or less adequately filled for the next season. Okay, let's see how it will develop further, but as for the gas, we are more or less sure that we already have enough gas in our storages and our facilities. Another question will be about fuel, electricity, as for many European countries. But coming back to the colleague from US, I don't think that US and the West, being NATO members or European countries, are in a very dramatic troubles because Russia has leverage only for this season. It tries to use it to maximum, but after this season, Russia will confront with a huge problem. Yes, it has quite a lot of gas, oil resources, but to whom to sell and how to sell? Already now, if you take the physical volumes provided by Russia, there is a decrease, both by gas and by oil, and it will go further. And this creates a huge troubles for Russian budget, which is already, for the first time for the last 20 years, is already with deficit. Because before all the years, the Russian budget was with profit. And now, with the huge spikes of gas and oil price, it is in deficit. So more and more, it will be some kind of, market economy prevailing over some political logic in Russia. And Russians do understand quite well that this season is the last season when they can coerce Europeans, Ukrainians, or anybody else to pressure, be it by gas, be it by some other resources supply, because all countries understood that it's quite sensible. It's the issue of national security not to be dependent on Russian resources or to have adequate supply from other sides. And many of the countries have already reoriented their supply routes and actually are reoriented more or less further. Therefore, I expect that after this winter season will end up, it will be quite difficult, let's be honest, for many of the countries. The electricity prices for many Western European countries or even Central European countries are already on the historic high level. But after this season ends up, there will be a huge problem for Russia with having a lot of resources, but not capable to sell these resources, having a huge deficit and having a war with Ukraine, actually losing per more and more, because actually, let's call it, if you compare the resources of both sides, so Ukraine together with the Western countries on the one side and Russia alone on the other side, actually the logic is against Russia.
Very good point you have raised, Mr. Semeni. Derived from your words, Mr. Speed, what are you saying about this? If you have enough resources, but you can't sell it, what is the situation over there like that?
Take a look at what's going on right now between the Russians and Saudi Arabia. The Russians are selling oil to Saudi Arabia that the Saudi Arabians are using in Saudi Arabia, and then they're selling their oil to the West. The same arrangements have been made with several other countries, not to mention Russia's sale of oil to India, the sale of oil to China. There are approximately 100 nations that, by the way, are saying nothing about the issue of the sanctions, particularly in the African and related nations. There's no isolation of Russia of the type that's being talked about. There's no way to do that. Matter of fact, let's look at the fact that also prices have gone up by 700% in every European nation and 1,000% in Germany. You cannot turn off the oil to the productive industries of Germany for a year or a month or 2 months and then just restart that industry. Now, this is a different situation. You're looking at a kind of crisis which actually could precipitate something like or greater than a full-scale physical breakdown crisis of the transatlantic sector. And you could see a situation, it may not see this situation, but it's possible you could see a situation where the Russia-China arrangement, the Russia-India arrangement, the Russia-Saudi Arabia arrangement, and other arrangements actually end up becoming as important in the world political and oil production as the relationships in the transatlantic sector. One last point is the speculation going on in Amsterdam, which is also another factor which is affecting all of this and is undermining everybody's interests. So there are many different people playing in this situation. It isn't a one-to-one. It isn't a sports game. This is something way more serious than that.
It's a very good point you have also raised. Now, Russia's market is kind of, it will be out of Europe. Now, to tackle another point, a United Nations Charter ship carrying 23 metric tons of Ukrainian grain arrived in East Africa on Tuesday, bringing much needed food at a time when aid agencies are warning of famine in the region. The UN's World Food Programme said that shipments would provide enough grain to feed 1.5 million people for a month, with Ethiopia said to be the main recipient, but it's not enough for a country facing several humanitarian challenges. Dr. Semeni, do you think the successful grain shipments made by Turkey and UN via the Black Sea will bring a solution and probably an end to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
No, definitely no, because if we're taking, let's call it the very precise terms, conflict, this conflict will have a long-term nature, while the war, so the military phase of the conflict, I hope could end maybe next year. But as for the grain, it's only one element. It was an agreement because actually here coincided the interests of too many parties who succeeded to agree on something and succeeded quite successfully. Until now, the grain corridor is more or less stably functioning and increasing its value, and hopefully it will help many people all around the world to have enough food and not to have these high prices, which was the case where our grain has been blocked. But this is only one element. Maybe some few elements, very practical nature one, could be added to some kind of agreements between Ukraine and Russia and through some mediators, be it Turkey, be it UN or somebody else. But in general, the conflict and the war will not end up because it is of critical nature. It is about of aggression from one state against another without any grounds. It's about some kind of idea or attempt to eliminate the whole nation from its sovereign rights, sovereign territory, or to be a nation in general. So you cannot find a solution until the other side, the aggressor, fully pushed back retreats, and afterwards we can actually agree on more or less some normal conditions how to do further, even not talking about some kind, reparations, compensations, so doing. But unfortunately, all the previous history, not only between our nation or in this region, make us a sign that such kind of wars, such kind of conflicts on the large scale and very comprehensive one, they cannot be settled like this in a very smooth way or in a very quick way. Unfortunately, we should wait for quite a long-term, some kind, let's call it, process of settlement on the one hand, and on the other hand, actually pushing back the aggressor to some norms and limits.
Understood. Mr. Speed, what are you saying about this? Is this gesture by Russia and even Ukraine only shows the world that this conflict is more strategic than being called the war of colonialism and invading lands?
Well, I think that your previous speaker is probably right that this would not stop the war. But let me say something about this, which I think is critical. You're going to need a new security and development architecture. And if you look at not merely the needs of Africa, but other parts of the world, you're talking about something like 1.2 billion people who are in danger in various ways of suffering starvation. It is true that those agreements are not only a first step, but an essential first step to feeding people around the world. Now, that is something that becomes possible to supersede the local conflict that's going on in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. To the degree we talk about it is that. But what is the conflict actually? The conflict's actually going on between NATO and Russia, and the United States and Great Britain in particular, and Russia. So here we find something interesting, because the negotiations that happened in Turkey that involved the government of Turkey and, of course, Ukraine and Russia were not only productive. The important point is that that's exactly the kind of meeting of self-interests, mutual self-interest, that has to supersede the conditions of war. I mean, it's very much like the question of talking about the security of Russia. Russia was trying to say something about that to people that people didn't want to hear, that the issue was a neutral Ukraine, not a destroyed Ukraine, not an occupied Ukraine, and they weren't in the areas that they were in. But this was simply not heard by the rest of the world, particularly from the transatlantic sector. Coming back to the specific point on food, let me simply say that Schiller Institute has been advocating the entire time that this idea of a world health platform involving food, clean water, sanitation, bringing many countries together, that's what we've been advocating. And we got put on a hit list, a kill list, by the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation. Our leader, Helga Sepp-LaRouche, and Harley Schlanger, and all these people were put on this list because we were advocating this. We don't get it. So we believe that there are people in Ukraine, but there are also people in NATO that don't want to see an end to conflict. Feeding people is one of the quickest and most efficient ways to end conflict.
Perfectly understood. Now, to tackle the last point, probably we do have a limited time. Mr. Speed, the international community faces a period of the toughest challenges since the World War II. The existence order faces serious challenges as the world enters a new era of crisis. This is the Japanese ministry warned in its request. By using these words, Mr. Speed, do you really think Russia's military operation in Ukraine could create another conflict in the different regions of the world, specifically the Indo-Pacific, where U.S. has increased tension with China over Taiwan?
Well, the United States just announced that they want to have a $1.5 billion arms deal with Taiwan. Frankly, what I believe is happening is the United States is just selling military equipment all over the world. Does that have to do with Russia? How's that got to do with Russia? Not to mention the fact that Taiwan happens to be part of China, which people seem to not understand. It's like Hawaii to the United States. Well, Hawaii is independent. When did it become independent? So you have a situation where people like Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of the United States Congress, goes and against what China asked her to do. Just don't go. She goes anyway. So are these conflicts, including the one in Ukraine, coming from Ukraine? Are they coming from Russia? Are they coming from China? Frankly, I severely doubt it. I believe that the conflicts emanate from the City of London and Wall Street. I believe they come from financial interests that are not even the interests of the United States. but I believe that what we are going to see happen in the next period, yes, it is very dangerous. Yes, it could even lead to real war, including thermonuclear conflict, which people like Jeffrey Sachs and others are talking about. But I hope that what's going to happen in the next days as this IAEA delegation arrives and as people begin to get a way of stepping back.
Thank you, Mr. Speed.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speed. Mr. Semeni, 1 minute left. So, what is your reading on this? Would the conflict in Ukraine create another conflict in a different region?
No, this conflict does not create any conflicts in other regions automatically and will not create. But there could be some link where you see actually destabilization of the whole security system, not only in Europe but globally. When you see the example that actually the state who in 1994 actually gave up its third largest that time and this time nuclear arsenal and afterwards has been attacked by the aggressor, namely one who undersigned sovereignty and respect for any territorial integrity, you have destabilization of the whole system. And you have to do something with this. And now you can see in many regions when other states who have some aggressive plans very carefully watching what is going on and thinking, if Russia prevails, if Russia succeeds, we can do the same thing against our neighbors, against other states. Perfect. So automatically it does not create this spillover effect, but many states all around the world are now watching what will be the end solution of this war, of this conflict. And if, for example, Ukraine will gain back its territory, will actually push back the aggressor, there will be a positive development of the whole security system.
I'm sorry to cut you train of thought, Mr. Semeni. To this end, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. A special thanks to our panel of guests, Dr. Semeni from Ukraine, Mr. Speed from USA. And for now, all I can say, take care of yourself and have a blessed day.